exceptions to the principles of the trading system. We have looked at the general exception under Article 20, security exception under Article 21, and the exception with regard to regional trading arrangements or agreements. So the purpose of those exceptions obviously is to give policy space for countries to adopt measures which are necessary to, which are in relation to the protection of those societal values that they want to protect. Of course, when we're dealing with regional arrangement exceptions, the purpose obviously is to give policy space for the members of this regional trading arrangement to adopt policies that would allow them to liberalize trade at a pace which is faster than what is envisaged within the WTO trading system. When we talk about policy space, giving space for countries to adopt measures, of course, an important consideration would be how developing countries are treated within the trading system. So with regard to the other exceptions that we talked about, like Article 20, 21, 24, it doesn't matter whether you are a developed country or a developing country. Since you have those objectives that you want to achieve, you can use those exceptions to avoid your obligation. A country can use those exceptions to avoid the obligations emanating from the principles of the trading system. But of course, we obviously cannot expect developing countries to trade in an equal manner with the developed countries. It's impossible, practically impossible, because there are so many constraints which would affect the meaningful participation of developing countries in the trading system. So if you say that I will allow this, I will have the same rule with regard to everyone, while everyone does not have the same capacity, then it wouldn't make sense. That's where this exception with regard to the development of the developing countries comes into picture, or what we call the special and differential treatment of the less developed countries, members of the WTO, or the developing countries. Of course, I don't know if I have mentioned it in one of the classes, but how do we determine when do we say countries, what factors do we take into account to say a country is a developed or a developing country?
What is the economic role of that country?
Okay. Delas? Yes? The life standard, life expectancy in GDP? Income. So basically GDP signal, income, and so on, life expectancy, እነዚህ ነገሮችን ኢንካም የሚወሰን ነው። So ኖርማሊ ማለት ነው እንደ ኢኮኖሚክስ ብታወሩ ለምሳሌ ወይም እንደ ኢኮኖሚክስ ብታስቡ የአንድ ሀገር ዴቨሎፕመንታል ስታተስ የት ጋር ነው? ሃይ ኢንካም ካንትሪ ነው ወይስ ሚድል ኢንካም ሎ ኢንካም የምንለው is going to depend on the GDP or the GNP of that country. Per capita income, ያለው ሪሶርስ ምናምን እነዚህን ፋክተሮች ኢንቱ አካውንት ተከተው ማለት ነው። So that is within, when we come to the WTO framework, on the other hand, okay, developed ነው ወይስ ሚድል ኢንካም ነው የሚለው በዛ መልኩ ሜቢ ልንጠቀም ልንለይ እንችላለን። When it comes to least developed countries, it's easy. It's easy because based on those factors, we have a list of least developed countries, or countries that are recognized as least developed countries by the United Nations. So we have right now about 38 countries. 38? I will have to check, sorry. 100, yeah, 38. Least developed countries. So you have a list under the United Nations. So if you want to know, to check if Ethiopia is an LDC, you just have to look at the list of the United Nations. If you want to know if Cambodia is a least developed country, you just have to look at that list. The list would be revised every now and then, taking into account the economic performance of the countries concerned. So countries would graduate from being a least developed country into a middle income or a developing country. So that's the case of Cape Verde, for example. A country which used to be a least developed country has graduated and became now, since 4 or so years ago, a middle income country. So you have at least differentiating between a least developed country and other countries is easy. Differentiating between a developed country and a developing country is difficult. Difficult, yes, you take into account those economic factors. Okay, but so for you, is China a developed country or a developing country? It's a developed. How about Brazil? India? Those countries, yes, from our perspective, maybe we feel that they are developed countries, okay? But they are not completely accepted as being the developed country. Even themselves, they do not consider themselves as developed ones, but rather as a developing one. Probably the right word could be an advanced developing country. So when it comes to the WTO, how you treat those countries is very important. If you treat them as a developed country, then it means you're not going to talk about those special and differential treatment provisions as applicable to that. But if they are considered as developing ones, then they would request to be entitled or to make use of those special arrangements or special and differential treatment provisions. So how does the WTO determine if a country is a developed one or a developing one? The funny thing is it's self-selection, meaning that the countries themselves declare if they are or not developed countries. So you have those Western countries who have already declared themselves to be developed countries should put on your mask as a developed country. But the other countries, India, China, Brazil, and so on, they declare themselves to be a developing country, so they are known as a developing country within the WTO framework. So we will later come to how this becomes a very contentious issue in terms of the application of the special and differential treatment. So just put that in your mind, okay, how we classify countries within the WTO. So coming to this special and differential treatment provisions, or the treatment of developing countries in the WTO. So as you know, before we have the WTO, what we had was a GATT system where you have a GATT contracting parties. And those 23 original GATT contracting parties, they were, many of them were developed countries, or the Western nations. And even those countries which we consider are less developed were represented through their colonizers. So ultimately, who was making the deal was the Western powers. So when you look at the first versions of the GATT agreement, there is no special treatment of the developing countries. Okay? everyone has the same obligation. Everyone was treated in the same way. There is no special treatment in any way afforded to the less developed contracting parties. But of course, that has to change after many of the countries became independent and they started to join this GATT, the trading system. So they started to request special kind of treatment. Okay? They were saying that we're not on equal footing with our former colonizers. They were in a better position to accumulate all the wealth, and they are in a better position to trade in a better manner than we are. So we need to get some kind of special arrangement or treatment under the GATT. So as a result of that, we have in the 1960s, mid-1965 and so on, the GATT agreement was modified and Part 4 was included. Part 4 of the GATT agreement. The title of that is, I think, Trade and Development, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, Trade and Development. So we have the inclusion of this part on trade and development. So when you look at the provisions under Part 4, what it does is it gives a kind of permission or green light for the developed countries to give some kind of preferential treatment for products that originate from the developing countries. So based on this permission, based on the Part 4 of the GATT agreement, a system that is known as the general system of preferences was introduced. So you have articles ranging, it's beginning from Article 36, Part 4 of the GATT, which gives permission, yes, for the developed countries to give some kind of special treatment for the developing countries. So based on that permission, what the developed countries started to do was to establish some kind of a general system of preferences, where products that originate from the developing countries would be allowed to access their markets either at a preferential rate or even at a 0%, depending on the preferential scheme that is introduced. But of course, this preferential system, when it is designed, it needs to be approved by the GATT contracting parties back then. And so that means every time you design a preferential scheme to benefit the developing countries, you have to bring that to the attention of the contracting parties, and they have to give their blessing to the contracting parties, meaning that working or as a kind of semi-initiative. They have to agree to whatever is your proposal. Plus, the waiver is not permanent, or in a sense that you have to probably you design the system for 2 years and then you have to again bring it back after the end of the second year. That kind of thing. There was no permanency in the system of preferences that was introduced at the very beginning. Because what we have under Part 4 is just a simple permission. Permission for the developed countries to somehow act outside of the obligations and benefit some group of countries because of their developmental status. But that is not a permanent one. So between 1965 and 1979, there were about 3 or 4 waivers which were given by the gas contracting parties, which allow these developed countries to treat preferentially the products originating from the developing ones. In 1979, a decision was passed by the contracting parties. The name of that decision is what we call the enabling clause. What the enabling clause does is it creates a permanent system of preferences. Okay. So that means a country, if the developed countries, if they want to extend a preferential scheme, they can design it as long as it fulfills the requirements of the enabling clause. There are some conditions. They don't need to take it back to the dot contracting parties, now the WTO institution, to gain waiver. GSP design ይደረግና waiver እንጠይቃለን። Every time preferential treatment extend ማድረጉን እንደዚህ እየሄዱ ከጋት contracting parties the structure the semi institution ነገር ምንለው waiver መገኘት ነበረበት ማለት ነው። ልክ 1979 ላይ ግን there was this decision, the 1979 decision on the enabling clause, which exempts developed countries permanently to treat preferentially the developing countries trading partners. So you don't have, the developed countries now, they can design their own preferences and they don't need to get kind of waiver from them. So you have, based on that, for example, though it is debatable, you have AGOA. It's debatable because it doesn't include all developing countries, but you can think of it in that way. We have the Everything But Arms initiative of the European Union, where everything produced in these developed countries, except for arms and ammunition, may be exported to the European market without having to pay any import duty at the time of importation to the European countries. You have also some differential arrangements given by India to LDCs. Also, of course, China extends also a more or less similar kind of scheme to LDCs. So when you explore or when you look at this preferential schemes which were developed by the US, by the European Union, India and China falls under these auspices of the enabling clause, what we call the general system of preferences. So the basic difference being in terms of the GSP before 1979 and after 1979 is one of permanency. Permanency in terms of not requiring a kind of a periodic waiver from the WTO. Of course, the preference granting country may still terminate the program, terminate the preference, the scheme that it has developed. But when we talk about permanency, we are talking about this relationship vis-a-vis the WTO system, whether or not you need to seek waiver from the WTO. So now countries, they do not have to seek periodical kind of waiver from the WTO. So yes, this was the beginning of how preferential treatments were started to be given to the developing countries. Of course, we have 1965 introduction of Part 4, 1979 introduction of the enabling clause, and then when you come to the 1995, the WTO agreements, you can see the developing, the number of countries which which were negotiating to form the WTO in 1994 and so on, were two main. So there were insistences from the different countries that special and differential treatment provisions should be included in almost all of those agreements. So you have the WTO agreement as annex. It has agreements dealing with trading goods, trading services, the dispute settlement, and so on. So if you look at each of those agreements, you will find at least one special and differential treatment provision contained in those different WTO agreements. But of course, the type and so on can be different. Okay. So what we will do now is we will look at the different types of special and differential treatment provisions which are contained in the GATT agreement, in the WTO agreement, sorry, including of course the GATT itself. Any questions so far? So if you assess the different agreements of the WTO, you can at least find out about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 5 types of special and differential treatment clauses. 5. The first types of SDT provisions are those provisions that aim at increasing the trade opportunities of the developing countries. Provisions that aim at increasing trade opportunities. A good example would be Article 37 of the GATT agreement. The developed members shall, to the fullest extent possible, that is exactly including reasons, which may include reasons to make it impossible, give effect to the following provisions. A, accord high priority to the reduction and elimination of barriers to products currently or potentially of particular export interests to less developed members. So, one way of increasing the trade opportunities of the less developed countries is giving high priority. High priority to products of export interest to the developing, the less developed countries. So basically, what you have at Article 37 is what we were talking about GSP. So this provision gives the green light for the developed countries to introduce measures which would target or which aim to increase the trade opportunities of the developed countries. So you give high priority to products of interest to the developing countries. For example, we have agricultural products would be considered as products of export interest for the developing countries. So you devise a system which allows the importation of, as a developed country, you devise a system which allows the importation of agricultural products from the developing countries at a very low tariff, or maybe at 0%. So, no GSP system introduced in the article, it allows them, it gives them the opportunity. So, developed countries shall, to the fullest extent possible, accord high priority to the reduction and elimination of barriers to products originating from the less developed countries. safeguarding the interests of developing countries. Provisions which require the developed members of the WTO to safeguard the interests of the developing countries, for example, when they introduce certain measures. Okay. Like, for example, if you look at the provision, one of the agreements dealing with trade in goods is what we call the space agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And the space agreement, what this space means is countries can like, for example, when we import orange juice, packed orange juice, we require that the package display something, some information with regard to the content of the juice. Okay, how much percent is actually fruit, how much percent is the preservative, what kind of preservative is added, is the preservative a kind that we accept as safe for consumption by human beings. Those are the things we call sanitary and phytosanitary measures. The law that we introduced a law which says that the level of the amount of preservatives that should exist in a particular food for consumption must be this percent. ወይም ደግሞ የፉድ ከለር እንጠቀማለን ለምሳሌ የሆነ የተሰራው የአንድ ፓኬት ተደረገ ምግብ ላይ ምን ያህል ፐርሰንት ነው ምን አይነት ፉድ አዲቲቭ እና ምን አይነት ፉድ ከለሪንግ ነው ሊገባ የሚችል የሚለውን ነገር የሚወስን እያንዳንዱ ሀገር የራሱ ህግ ይኖራል። ኢትዮጵያ ማለት የራሳችን ማለት ነው። ቤዚክሊ we may use international standards or we may have our own standards. That's what we call sanitary and phytosanitary standards. So the purpose is protecting the health, life, and so on of the consumers of that item. So, article the agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures stipulates certain things, certain rules, which dictate the way or the manner or how it should look like when a country introduces an space measure, what it should take into account and so on. Minimum measure. Substantive wise ሳይሆን space measure ለምሳሌ በሀገራቶች መካከል ዲስክሪሚኔት ማያደርግ መሆን አለበት ምናምን የሚሉ ሩሎች ናቸው። ግን ምን ቤት ያን ሩል ስናወጣ መከተል ያለብን ነገር ስፔስ አግሪመንት ላይ አሳሳሪ የሚያስቀምጣቸው ነገር ሶ እዛ ያንን አግሪመንት ስፔስ አግሪመንት አርቲክል 10.1 ስንመለከት ምን ይለናል? In the preparation and application of sanitary or phytosanitary measures, members shall take account of the special needs of developing country members, and in particular of the least developed countries. So what it is saying is, yes, of course, the health of your consumers comes first. You can introduce any sanitary and phytosanitary measure. But when you introduce these measures, when you introduce a law on sanitary and phytosanitary measure, then taking in the preparation of those measures, plus when you apply that, you should take account of the special needs of the developing and least developed countries. Similar kind of provision is also found in the agreement on safeguards. The agreement on safeguards basically deals with a scenario in which, for example, example, following the trade negotiation, around the trade negotiations, countries agreed to reduce their tariff and they started to apply this reduced amount of tariff. But as a result of this reduction, the amount of imports that came to those countries happened to be beyond what was foreseen at the time of tariff negotiation. So in such circumstances, even if the exporters did not do anything foul, even if they did not dump their products, even if their government did not support the producers, the legitimate trade that took place between the two countries have harmed the local producers of the importing country. So in such circumstances, the safeguard agreement allows such importing country to take actions like suspending the recent tariff concession, basically aimed at protecting the local producers. So yes, there are of course conditions. ዝም ብለን ተነስተን አይደለም safeguard action መውሰድ የምንችለው። We're dealing with pure የሆነ ትክክለኛ trade in a sense. ለባለፉት 3 ወር ኔጎሽት ስናደርግ ቆየንና ኔጎሽት ባደረግነው መሰረት ኔጎሽት አድርገን ለመቀነስ እሺ ስንል ቤዚክሊ የራሳችንን ኢኮኖሚክ አሰስመንት እንሰራለን። የስ ኢምፖርት ሰርጅ ሊያደርግ ይችላል፣ ሊጨምር ይችላል፣ ግን ከኮንትሮል ከምናደርገው በላይ አይደለም ብለን አስዩም አድርገን ነው እንግዲህ ተስማማ ነው ማለት ነው። ነገር ግን አንፎርቹኔትሊ when that actually materializes, when we actually reduce our tariff, the amount of import that surged into the market happens to be beyond what we had expected at the time of negotiating the tariff reduction. So that was the time where a country would be allowed to take safeguard action. So strict የሆኑ ሪኳየርመንቶች አሉት እዛ ስትሪክት የሆኑ ሪኳየርመንቶቹ ለሁሉም ሀገራቶች አፕላይ የሆኑና when it comes to a safeguard action targeting imports from developing countries, we have Article 9, paragraph 1, which says, safeguard measures shall not be applied against a product originating in a developing country member, as long as its share of imports of the product concerned in the importing member does not exceed 3%, provided that developing country members with less than 3% import share collectively account for ሁለተኛው ምትሆነ የመጀመሪያው ብቻ ነው ብንመለከታት ማለት ነው። assuming that ሁለተኛው ምትሆነ if the share of imports from the concerned developing country does not is a maximum of 3% of the total import of that product in the importing country, then the safeguard measure will not be applied against that developing. So when you look at those provisions, the provisions, I mean, we can also have that similar provision in the TBT in another agreement, but the purpose of those provisions in the safeguard agreements, space agreement and TBT agreement is to protect, to safeguard the interests of the developing countries from, of course, from the measures that are to be introduced by the developed ones. So, a space measure, enforceability will come. But anyways, this is the second type of SDT provision that we have. The other types of SDT provisions are those that provide flexibility. Flexibility of commitments. Flexibility of commitments, of action and use of policy instruments. So, in this regard, a good example would be what we have under the agreement on agriculture, for example. The agreement products in the same way as that. In trade, with regard to trade in agriculture, one of the things is that we need to reduce the tariff. Overall objective የደረጃው ምንድነው ስንል liberalization, progressive liberalization of trade. Progressive liberalization of trade with regard to both industrial products and agricultural products, plus also the services sector. So when it comes to flexibility of commitments, what we are talking about is lesser obligation. Lesser obligation for the developing countries. So, for example, the agreement on agriculture, for example, it requires that the tariff, it requires the countries to reduce their tariff on average by 24% over 10 years. Developed countries are required to do that by 36% over So you have for developing, you have 24%, and for developed, you have 76%. And LDCs are exempt from reduction components. They don't have reduction components. So, ምን ማለት ነው ያ? ያለንን አሁን ያለውን የታሪፍ መጠን ዴቨሎፒንግ ሀገራቶች ከሆኑ ታይም ፍሬሚንግ ተቀምጧል። በ10 ዓመት ውስጥ ነው የሚለን አትሊስት ከአሁን ካለበት ሁኔታ በ24% የቀነሰ መሆን አለበት። ዴቨሎፕ ያደጉ ሀገራቶች ሲሆን ያ በ36% የቀነሰ ማለት ነው። አበይ ፒሪድ አይደል? ኤንድ ኤፍዲሲስ ደግሞ they are exempt. So we call this flexibility of commitment. The commitment that's undertaken by the developed and the developing countries is not the same. The developing countries have assumed a lesser obligation under the agreement in agriculture. Similar thing can be observed also in the agreement on subsidies. And in that agreement, the requirement is that, of course, there are certain types of subsidies which are considered unknown, meaning that you cannot have them. And if you maintain or if you have them before joining the WTO or before the establishment of the WTO, then there is a certain period of time within which you are expected to bring that type of support to a zero. So for the developing countries, the zero ስናመጣው ደግሞ ኦቨርናይት አይደለም ዜሮ ይተከፈለ 5 ዓመት ተሰጥቶን እንደሆነ the first year ላይ በዚህ ያለው ቀጣዩ ላይ በዚህ ያለው እየሰጠን ያለው ሰፖርት እየቀነስን ዜሮ ማምጣት አለብን የተከለከለ ሰፖርት so እንዲያነው ኮሚኒቲ requirements ያለባቸው provision ስንመለከት if they have an ICDT provision what they do is the commitments that's going to be undertaken by the developing countries is lesser. Okay? Less for one economy. ከዚህ ጋር አብሮ ተያይዞ የሚሄደው ፍሌክሲቢሊቲ ኦፍ ኮሚትመንትስ ጋር አብሮ የምናገኘው ምንድነው? ሎንገር ትራንዚሽን yes, under the agreement on agriculture, for example, the developing countries are expected to reduce the tariff overall, on average, by 24% over a period of 10 years. Whereas the requirement for the developed countries is to reduce it by 36% over a period of 6 years. So developed countries are given a shorter period of time to comply with their commitment, whereas developing countries are given a longer transition period, a longer period to comply with their commitments. We can also find a similar kind of thing in the TRIPS agreement, for example. The TRIPS agreement requires the members of the WTO to comply with their intellectual property with the TRIPS agreement. So the compliance period that's given for the developing countries and the DCs is different. developed countries are given shorter period of time within which they are expected to bring their national legislation with regard to property rights in compliance with the agreement. The developed countries are, the developing are given longer, and LDCs are given a much longer period of time to comply with the truth agreement. So this is another type of special financial adjustment provision. Probably the last would be, as a type of SPT, is those that talk about the technical assistance to the less developed countries. We find different provisions, like for example in the space agreement again, you have Article 9 where it says members agree to facilitate the provision of technical assistance to other members, especially developing country members, either bilaterally or through the appropriate international organization. So you have one example, the space agreement, where the developing countries will undertake to give technical assistance to the less developed members of the community. We can also have SDT provisions within the settlement understanding. One way of addressing the interests of developing countries is to make sure that at least to make sure that their interest is somehow reflected in the settlement process. When there is a dispute between a developed and a developing country, one of the members of the panelists would be from a developing country, because the assumption being that these panelists from a developing country would understand more the point of view of the developing and the developing country. So you have different types of different provisions within the WTO agreement that deal with how we can financially treat the developing countries in order to ensure their integration into the trading system. Equally, there's a difference, developmental, economically, there is a difference between the developed and the developing countries and LDCs. So they should be treated in a different way, communal. So yes, it's one, it's a good step. It's a good step that this need of the developing countries is recognized by the members of the development. And it's reflected in the provisions of the different agreements. But then there's always another challenge to this. Okay? One of the challenges is enforceability. How enforceable are these provisions? That's a very big question. You may have thousands of provisions, but when you examine deeply these provisions and assess whether or not they can be applied, actually implemented, I mean, they may always, that may always be the case. There is debate, criticized rather, not debate, but criticized. Like for example, let's begin with, from the first one, the one which talks about increasing trade opportunities. So what is required from the developing countries is giving high priority for interest. When you look at the provision, Article 37 of the data agreement, yes, it says shall. The mere fact that a provision contains a word shall does not necessarily make it a concrete obligation. Okay. The developing third party or members shall, to the fullest extent possible, that is, except when are compelling reasons which may include legal agency make it impossible, give effect to the following provisions. Accord high priority to the reduction and elimination of barriers. So what you are required, what a developed country is required to do is give high priority. I mean, in effect, what የጠየቀ ያለው ምንድን ነው ስትል ጂኤስፒ ሲስተም ኢንትሮዲውስ አድርጉ ነው። ዲስ ኢዝ ራሱ የቃላቱን አጠቃቀሙ ራሱ ስንመለከት ኢዝ ኢት ሪሊ ሻል የሚል ነገር ስለተጠቀመ ብቻ ነስናዊ ኢንፎርሰብል የሆነ ወይም ጠንከር ያለ ነው ማለት ላይሆን ይችላል። ካሉት ነባራዊ ያሉት መንገዶች ሁሉ መመለከት ያስፈልጋል። ኦኬ ሃይ ፕራዮሪቲ እንዲሰጥ ነው የተባልኩት እንጂ ለምሳሌ ኮንክሪት ማድረግ ቢፈለግ ለምሳሌ ከኤልቢሲስ የሚመጣ ፕሮዳክት ኢን ኤቭሪቲንግ 0% አድርጉላችሁ ብሎ አሳና ኢንፎርስብል አስ ፖሲብሊ ኢንፎርስብል ኦብሊጌሽን ሊቀመጥ ይችላል ነበር። but it's not crafted in such a way. So that means we're just giving permission for the developed countries to give high priority to our products. Yes, I have the permission to do so, but if I don't want to do so, then there is nothing that forces me to do so. So yes, you have it. Yeah, it's a good thing. When we have a very good trade relationship with the developed ones, or when they have products which are of interest for them, not of export interest to the developing countries, but of import interest for the developed countries themselves, they may devise those schemes. So yes, and even ሁለተኛው type of SCP provision the one that requires to safeguard the interests. Article 10, Article 10, paragraph 1. In the preparation and application of sanitary or phytosanitary measures, members shall take account of the special needs. So the requirement is one of taking account. Yes, I have taken account of your interest, but I feel that I still want to introduce this measure. What proof do we have that the country has actually taken into account our need? So, safeguarding the interests of developing countries, particularly with regard to the SPS measure, እንግዲህ አንደኛ ያው ምን አይነት ኢንትረስት ነው ባላንስ እያደረግን ያለ የሚለው ማየት አለ። ኤስፔስ ሜጀሩ ኢንትሮዲውስ የምናደርገው ለምንድን ነው ስንል መጠበቅ የምንፈልገው ጤና አለ። ኮንሱመሮች የኮንሱመሩን ጤና መጠበቅ እንፈልጋለን። So based on the evidence that we have, we introduce certain measures. And we say, unless any measure I'm primarily accountable to my citizens, not to the citizens of another country. So I introduce certain measures. So obviously, in this scenario, the requirement to take into account the interests of other countries below requirement, obviously, it's untenable. So when you look at how the way Article 10 of this space agreement is crafted, you can say that it's not enforceable. From the very outset, it seems that the intention is not to ensure the enforceability of such kinds of provisions because we have other interests of the consumers in the country, obviously would outweigh in the face of the importing country, such interests would outweigh the interests of the exporting ones. ሌላ ቦታ ላይ ስንመጣ የቲቢቲ አግሪመንት ጋር ስንመጣ እንደዛው ነው። consider we have to consider shall take into account of ልክ የሆነ apply ስናደርግ ወይም introduce ስናደርግ measure we have to take into account the interests of the developing countries. So taking into account is not obviously a complete transition period for the developing countries, of course, they are implementable, enforceable matter. Even there's different case with regard to the subsidies where Brazil, there was a complaint against Brazil. Brazil used to give export subsidy to an aircraft which is manufacturer of aircraft based in Brazil. So this measure was challenged by other countries. Export subsidy ማለት ኢሊጅብል የምንሆነው ሰፖርት ገንዘብ ነው ኖርማሊ ያንን ገንዘብ ለማግኘትም ወይንም ፕሮባብሊ ታክስ ምናምን ቅነሳም ሊሆን ይችላል። ዞሮ ዞሮ ሰፖርት ኢሊጅብል የምንሆነው ፕሮዳክታችንን ኤክስፖርት የምናደርግ ከሆነ ነው። ኤክስፖርት የማናደርግ ከሆነ ለሰፖርቱ ኢሊጅብል አለ። የዚህ አይነት support schemes are said to be trade destructive. So export subsidies are not allowed under the subsidy agreement. So we have the WTO coming into effect in 1995. So that is when this rule was introduced. But countries are given, those countries that maintained export subsidies are given certain period of time within which to phase out their export subsidies. Brazil, as a developing country, was given is entitled to a longer period of time. The complaint against Brazil was brought against it before this the transition period envisaged under the subsidies agreement has lapsed. So Brazil defended by saying that yes, I'm expected to phase it out, but not immediately. After this, the formation of the WTO, but within a certain time. And I am entitled to such time because Article 27 of the agreement allows me a longer transition period. In the court, the panel accepted this defense forwarded by Brazil. So yes, some of the provisions, and we have these provisions obviously, are the way they are crafted makes them enforceable. What? And we have also examples where it has been implemented. The last one, technical assistance, is again, it's very difficult to order which country to give technical assistance to. It's an issue, a moral issue. It's not. You cannot say it's a concrete kind of obligation. Provision ስንመለከተው ለምሳሌ የስፔስ አግሪመንቱ members agree to facilitate. The obligation is one facilitating. They have agreed to facilitate the provision of technical assistance to the developed countries. Project ቀርጸን እናስቀምጠን እንችላለን። Okay, see how I have this project. I aim at helping country X, which is a least developed country, in developing its sanitary and phytosanitary measure. I don't have the money, so I'm sorry. That's minimum. Obviously, force ማድረግም የሚቻል አይነት ነገር ስላልሆነ ማለት ነው። So yes, it's one step in terms of recognizing the need of these developing countries, developing and least developed countries. To recognizing the challenge they are facing to meaningfully participate in the trading system. But obviously the system needs a lot of improvement. አሁን ባለው ሁኔታ እነዚህ ፕሮፊሎች መቀመጣቸው አንድ ነገር ነው። ችግር እንዳለ መረዳት በራሱ አንድ ስቴፕ ሲሆን ያንን ስቴፕ ደግሞ ማሻሻል ሌላ ነገር ሌላ ማለት ነው። So these are types of SDT provisions and the agreement of the debate regarding their enforceability. Any question? Just few additional points. አሁን ዲስካውንት እናወራቸው የነበሩት ነገሮች የምናወራው ምንድን ነው? ትሬድ ሪሌሽንሽፑ በዴቨሎፕድ ኤንድ ዴቨሎፒንግ ካንትሪስ መካከል በሚኖርበት ጊዜ ምን ማድረግ አለባቸው የሚለው ነገር ኢምፓክት የሚከተል ይሄ ክሎዝ ከዛ የዘለለ ነገሮችን ያደርጋል in a sense አሁን ለምሳሌ ምን አለ አርቲክል 37 ግሪን ላይት ይሰጣል ትሬድ ኦፖርቹኒቲ ክሬት እንዲያደርግ so for the developed countries so what they do is they would establish a GSP system but when they establish a GSP system it has to comply with the requirements of the enabling clause enabling clause ያስቀመጣቸው ነገሮች ይኖራሉ so basically what this enabling clause I mean this is yes it's a decision ራሱን የቻለ separate decision of the contracting parties in 1979 but it forms part of the WTO because look ያኔ WTO agreement annex ያደረጉ ምንድን ነገሮችን ነው ስንል እነዛን አግሪመንቶች አሉ plus decisions which were made between 1947 and 1994 interpretations at the certain interpretation of so ይሄም እንግዲህ this is the enabling clause is a decision of the contracting parties which still has which is incorporated in the WTO system right now so it's what it does is it's an exception to Article 1 to the enabling convention ምንድነው የሚሰጠው permanent የሆነ exception ነው የሚሰጠው ጂኤስፒ ፎርም ስታደርጉ የአርቲክል 1 ኦብሊጌሽን አይኖርባችሁም ነው ያ ማለት ምንድነው ኤክስ አደ ዴቨሎፕድ ካንትሪ ናት ዋይ ዜድ ኤ ያለን እናስብ ዋይ እና ዜድ ዴቨሎፒንግ ካንትሪስ ናቸው ስንል ጂኤስፒ ሲስተም ኤክስ ኢንትሮዲውስ ብታደርግ ኤ even if is a member of the WTO cannot request the extension of Article 1 and MFN and benefit from this GSP system. The enabling clause exception ነው የአርቲክል 1 exception ነው እየሰጠን ያለው ማለት ነው so when you look at each of the provisions the notwithstanding the provisions of Article 1 in the decision of first paragraph Article 1 of the General Agreement contracting parties may accord differential and more favorable treatment to developing countries without according such treatment to other contracting parties. This is an exception to Article 1 and so to what things should this such preferential arrangement apply? The provisions of paragraph 1 apply to the following. 1. Preferential tariff treatment accorded by developed contracting parties to products originating in developing countries in accordance with the General System of Preferences and differential and more favorable treatment with respect to the provisions of the GATT concerning tariff increase governed by the provisions of instruments multilaterally negotiated. Regional or global arrangements entered into amongst less developed countries. Different feature ያስቀመጠው እዚህ ላይ differential and more favorable treatment with respect to the provisions regional or global arrangements entered into amongst less developed RTS ይሄ ማለት ምን ማለት ነው ስንል we have the requirements of Article 24 in the formation of regional trading agreements, where you have those internal and external requirements. So you have internal requirements, for example, substantial trade, where it's required that substantially all, the trade barriers must be eliminated with regard to substantially all trade. Substantially all trade ስንል ወደ 80% ብለን ኢንተርፕሬት ከኤክስፒሪየንስ ካየነው ወደ 80% ልንል እንችላለን። ከዛ በላይም ኤክስተርናሊ ደግሞ ወደ ለሶስተኛ ወገኖች ላይ ትሬድ ሊበራላይዝ ማድረግ ነው እንጂ ለሶስተኛ ወገኖች ትሬድ ቤሪየር መፍጠር አይደለም። ስለዚህ ኤክስተርናል ሪጋርድ ይሄ እንግዲህ አርቲክል 24 የሚያወራው with regard to all regional trading arrangements, whether that regional trading arrangement is made between a developed country, among developed countries, or between a developed and a developing country, or this developed country and minimum category, special treatment in law. Enabling clause with regard to if this regional arrangement is made or is intended amongst less developed countries, if countries X, Y, Z that are members of XYZ FTA, free trade area, are all members of the are all developing countries, then they may invoke the enabling clause and may adopt something less than the substantially all trade requirements of Article 24. So they may say, we are developing countries, so we will liberalize, eliminate trade barriers with regard to 60% of the trade that goes on between us. Substantially all trade, no way. We don't take on that. 60% trade liberalization የሚመለከተው 60% of the trade will go between us ነው ብሎ ሲያስቀምጡ ይሄ ነገር ሰብስታንሻሊ ኦል ትሬድ ነው ወይ ብለን ጥያቄ የምንጠይቀው ማለት ነው። ኮምፓቲቢሊቲ አርቲክል 24 ነው የምናወራው ብለን አርቲክል 24 ኮምፓቲብል ነው አይደለም። ምክንያቱም በምን አይነት መልኩ ነው እስካሁን ኢንተርፕሬት ሲደረግ የነበረው ፕሮባብሊ ወደፊትም የሚደረገው አትሊስት 80% ትሬድ ቢትዊን ደም መስቢ ሊበራላይዝድ ነው። ነገር ግን በኢኔብሊንግ ክሎዝ መሰረት ኖቲፋይ የምናደርገው ከሆነ ቢኮዝ ሁሉም አቆራጮች developing countries ሆኖ they may be we will be entitled to not 100% exemption, okay? 100% ከኤስኤቲ አፕላይ ያደርጉብን ማለት አይደለም። ኢንተርናል ሪኳየርመንት ሙሉ ለሙሉ አፕላይ ያደርጉብን ሳይሆን to a lesser degree አፕላይ ያደርጉብን ይችላል። አሁን ለምሳሌ ኢስት አፍሪካን ኮሚኒቲ ብንመለከተው እንዴት ነው ኖቲፋይ የተደረገው to the WTO ስንል through the enabling clause በኢኔብሊንግ ክሎዝ ነው። ምክንያቱም lesser requirement, stringent, less stringent ሆኖ requirement I think Commissar SGO በዛም መሰል በእኛ ስላለ anyways ይሄ እንግዲህ መጀመሪያ ላይ ስናወራ ከነበረው ሰምተው ትንሽ ለየት ያለ ነው። ኦኬ ቅድም ስናወራ የነበረው ያደጉ ሀገራቶች ላላደጉ ለታዳጊ ሀገራቶች የሚሰጡትን ነገር ሲሆን ይሄ ደግሞ ታዳጊ ሀገራቶች እርስ በርሳቸው የሚኖራቸው ስምምነት ፍሪ ትሬድ ኤሪያ ፎርም እናደርጋለን። ለምሳሌ ያህል አርቲክል 24 ሪኳየርመንት ሰምሃው ለስ የሆነ ነገር እንዲያመጡ እንዲያገኙ የሚያደርጋቸው የሚያሳየን ማለት ነው። ያ ሌላው ሞቲቭ ሊሆን ይሄዳል። ሌሎች ሊተንካፍ ክሎዝ yes ዲቤት ስና ማለት ቻሌንጅ ሲደረግ ነው ኖርማሊ ወደዛ ምን ሄደው እንትን የሚደረገው ማለት ነው። አሁን የኢስት አፍሪካን ኮሚኒቲን ስንመለከት ኢቭን ኢፍ በኢኔብሊንግ ክሎዝ ቢያስተዋውቁትም ከ80% ያነሳ አይደለም። ፖሊሲ ፍሌክሲቢሊቲ እንዲኖረን ስንል የምናደርጋቸው የምንወስዳቸው ሜጀሮች ኦኬ ለእኛ አድቫንቴጅ የሚሰጠንን ነገር ቀድመን እንትን እናደርግና ካላየን አይተን ሁኔታውን ካልተመቸን ማስተካከል እንድንችል አይ ቲንክ የዚህ አይነት ስትራቴጂ የሚጠቀሙ ይመስለኛል። ሶ ቻሌንጅ ስላልተደረገ ጁሪስፕሩደንስ ዴቨሎፕ የተደረገ ነገር አናገኝም። Any other question?